Hello, Bright Bible family. This is Monica. So, we are going to be here in Philippians, and we are in chapter 4. Now, the reading plan has verses 14 through 23, which is this tail end of the entire book of Philippians. You can probably see that here. I got to make sure I'm on screen. But I am actually going to bump up just a tiny bit here. Now, there's a lot of meat, I think, meat and potatoes in this last part of the section of this, not only this chapter, but of the book in whole. But I'm really struck by something when I read through this that I just never really paid attention to before. And I wonder how many of you have as well. So this is coming from Paul, obviously. And he is writing to the church. And you can read through the book. It's a very, very short book, obviously 4 chapters. I would highly encourage you to just study through the whole thing and journal through the whole thing. But I wanted to take note of a very, very popular verse. I'm sure that you all have heard this verse, and many of us, people have tattoos of this verse, and it's life verses for many. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. And this is Philippians 4:13. I'm sure many of you even have that memorized. But there's something here before that in the 2 verses ahead of that I really love. And I guess I've never read it in its context the same way that I did here getting ready to do this study with you. So let's go ahead and skip up here to verse 10. This last section is called God's provision. I rejoice in the Lord greatly that now at length you have revived your concern for me. You were indeed concerned for me, but you had no opportunity. He's talking about previously. Now that I'm speaking of being in need, or not that I'm speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I want you right now, if you're reading along with me, I want you to underline, for I have learned. This is going to be important here in the context of this. I have learned in whatever situation that I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through who strengthens me. I want to read a little bit further. Just a little bit further. Let's come back. Yet it was kind of you to share my trouble. And it says here, or have fellowship. So to understand and to be a part of his trouble. And you, Philippians, yourselves, know that in the beginning of the gospel, when I left Macedonia, no church entered into partnership with me in giving and receiving except only you. And this basically is this tail end, is he is recognizing and bringing notice to the fact that this church treated him, cared for him, supplied his needs, and I believe financially. It kind of goes back and refers back a little bit here into chapter 2, and you can get into that. But what I really never saw before is that this phrase, I can do all things who strengthens me, it's not to be received in the way that I think we often use it, which is like, this is going to be tough to say this, but almost to be like super, like to be a superhero in a sense of like, with God I can do anything. Well, that is true. But what he's talking about is contentment. Not that he can do something that's just so above and beyond the norm. But he's talking about the things that are not natural for him as a man. It's not natural for mankind to be content. We struggle with this. We struggle with contentment over and over again, whether we have Christ in our life or not. We struggle with being content when things are bad. But yet, if we grow to learn to be content, if we use Christ as the rock to bring contentment to us, if we practice that over and over again, we're okay in bad situations. And we learn that in those situations, God can really use us and speak to us. And he also says, I've learned how to abound. Not many people are great at abounding. When things are going really good, it's very easy to say, well, I don't even need Jesus right now. I don't need God's help because things are so good. But he's had to learn that in every circumstance, whether he's been hungry or whether he's had plenty, he's had to learn how to be content. And he's giving all of that credit to God. The only reason that he's learned to be content and to learned to be okay with the highs and lows of life is because it was God's strength. That's incredible to me. I have never, ever, ever read this way, and I'm not even really sure that I've read the context of that at all together. It's very interesting to me, and this is one of those things where I think there's a lot of encouragement in this verse, and I definitely don't think there's anything wrong with the way everybody has to be able to interpret and cling to verses of Scripture that are those bits of truth. But there's so much more richness here in its complete and utter package, in its context. So I was thinking about this idea of finding peace and contentment in all circumstances. And as you know, Paul has led on, this was something he had to learn. It didn't come natural. And I think about my own self, and I think about highs and lows. And so that's what I started to really think about here with this particular journal entry, was what to me is highs and lows. How can you represent that? This would be a great passage of Scripture for that. So I am actually working quite large on this, but this is definitely a page that I think you could take the pieces of and downsize for your journal. But I was thinking about that. I've seen this tattoo or this sticker, and it's, let me see if I can draw it out for you. Let me grab a piece of paper here from the printer. It's God is greater than the highs and lows. I'm sure you've seen that before, but it's God is greater than the highs and lows. If you've ever seen this before, you may not have even known what that meant, but that's what it meant. So this would be a really cool thing, I think, just to play with this. Imagine kind of having like hollowed letters and being able to color it. I think this would be a really cool place to put that. I'd love to see if you guys end up using that for this. God's greater than the highs and lows. He gives us that he teaches us how to use him for contentment rather than other things. But what I've got drawn for us here, we're going to do some watercolor. So I've got my watercolor set. I also have some Scribble sticks because I think I want to be kind of playful. I'm not sure I want to have, perfectly painted or drawn. I think I want to just have some fun. But I am going to use a black Sharpie for some of the outlining of my teeter-totter. And I also want to play around with pattern in our arrows. I just want that teeter-totter and arrows to kind of come forward and be more defined, and I want some of the background to be more subtle. So the first thing that we're going to do here is I'll go ahead and trace out this so that you guys can kind of follow along as I draw. And what I'm going to show you here is with pen, but of course with pencil I will have gone through. So I'll show you that as we go. So the first thing when we're drawing this teeter-totter, again, you're going to have to decide if you're doing this on a skinny margin. You're going to have to do this a lot. This bar that's holding the teeter-totter may have to be skinnier, and your teeter-totter may have to be more up and down. Or if you do it long ways on your page, maybe flipping your margin this way. So just kind of adjust this drawing however it may work for you. But what I've got here is just a really simple, like basically a 3-sided box was what I started with. And I'm going to have these bars. I have to make sure my arrow doesn't get covered, so let me get that arrow corner in there. All right. So I'm going to have these bars that come down and would kind of be in the ground. I don't have a straight edge, but I would strongly suggest if you do, let me see if I can use my pencil. Sometimes I'm just terrible about having a ruler nearby. Yeah, there we go. And then I would have that same thing over here. And again, I have my arrows already sketched in. And you may want to do those arrows first or just erase when you get to them. That's what I did, as I drew the bars in first and the teeter-totter. And then I just kind of drew over them with these arrows. but I don't want to make mistakes when I've got my pen in my hand. So let me get those in there. Okay, so I've got the bar over here, same over here. So just parallel across. Let's see. Here and here. And then on these corners, I'm thinking kind of old school playground. I know that at our school, they were always made out of metal piping. So I'm kind of thinking about those connection pieces that were just slightly bigger on the corner. Another one over here, just slightly bigger. A little more rounded on the ends. Okay. And then I can go ahead and connect with two more parallel lines. Let's see if I can get it in here. I'm telling you, I need to get a smaller ruler. Yep, I can tell you, I just messed that up. That's okay. Need to get myself a tiny, tiny ruler. So once you kind of have that drawn in, and of course you would draw through that with pencil, then you're going to put in your long teeter-totter. And what you're going to be doing is just drawing the flat part of the board. And what I do is I give myself a baseline. This is where I want this end, and I want this end to be just slightly larger. So the reason we want this side to be a little bit longer, wider, I should say, is because we are doing this in perspective. So this side is a little bit closer to us. So we're going to keep this side wider, this side skinnier, but yet just connect those lines. Okay, so that's the top part, like where I would sit if I was on this teeter-totter. Just bring that all the way down. Just make sure if you've already got your little handles drawn in that you're super careful. Okay. And then from here, what I'm going to do is just give myself 3 little tiny tick marks straight down. 1, 2, 3. And these 3 should be just about the same size. And then what we're going to do is connect them parallel here, and then the long ways as well. So I'm going to get that big old ruler out again, get these connected. Obviously, you can make your teeter-totter as simple or as complex as you would like. There's some super fun teeter-totter designs out there. You could have a lot of fun with this. I just made this super duper duper basic. Put some wood grain in here. So what I'm going to do also now is to use my pen. This is really the last place that I'll use my pen until I decorate, is just tracing these 2 arrows. So I have the arrow that's going up, and I have that arrow that's coming down to show both the highs and the lows, when I abound and when I plummet. So there's the basic drawing of our teeter-totter, okay? Now what I'm going to do here is start working in the background with some watercolor. And we are going to do some really basic landscape painting. And what I want to encourage you is to definitely have either a piece of paper, or if you have a plastic mat. I really need to get myself some more. Guys, I've said this before, but for those of you watching, if you don't have a good plastic mat, and what I mean is like a little craft mat or protective mat, find a plastic folder, like a 2-pocket folder, and cut that up, or a cutting board, a real flimsy little like dollar store cutting board. Those 2 things make the perfect mats, and I need to get mine dug out because I know I have them here somewhere. But that's great because that little bit of plasticky material helps for nothing to be going through. I've got my water nearby, and I just need to grab a brush. You can either use a water brush like this here, something that has the water inside, or just a regular paintbrush, and I'll probably grab a few of each. Let's see here. So I've got some various sized brushes. Our flat tip brushes are usually for bigger spaces, and then the smaller ones for good little details. So we'll just kind of have these in hand. And I think what we're going to actually do is kind of start in the sky. And so what I have here, and I'm going to trace this so that you can see it. What I've done is I've just kind of broken up the background into layers. So I'm thinking about the sandbox where this playpen may be, or this teeter-totter. I'm thinking like the playground, right? The next one, I might see some darker green grass. I might see some bushes, some green grass and some bushes. So I'm just kind of giving myself some layers here. Green grass. And then I may see like the tips of trees coming through here. And then it would have like a blue sky. So really, really simple landscape is what we're going for. So I will, let's see if I can scoot this over just the tiniest bit. See if we can still see on camera. I can get my colors in here. And I'll just start with that sky. And one little trick I can tell you, and I'm not sure how well it'll work here with this little space, but what I'm going to do is just kind of warm up a couple of blue colors. Always tell my kids, my little kids when I was teaching elementary school, warm up your colors, wake them up. Wake them up with some paint, with some water. We're just going to paint really loosely, okay? Now, there is a little trick if you want to create kind of this idea of a cloud, is to get yourself a small piece of toilet paper, ball it up, and right when you've painted, you can then lift, and that you can do that. You can do that multiple times. Now I'm going to paint in layers, but what would be very silly would be for me to paint the trees next. So I'm starting with the sky. It's going to allow me to come down here and work on this kind of sandy area, okay? And then we'll go tree, bushes, grass. And that will be, you know, a little different colors of our green layers. It does not take much to give yourself some sort of an implied landscape. That's the one beautiful thing about landscapes, is it's that layering effect of colors that does the trick. Okay, so what I'll do now is to kind of come back up here. This is pretty dry. It's dry enough that I'm not afraid of the bleeding of color. So I actually want to make sure that in here I can be a little more specific with my green. So I'm going to actually start with a lighter kind of a turquoisey limey green in this back section of tree. Okay, so I'm going to go from light to dark is basically what I'm saying. And you know what? I think I'm going to switch at this point to a round brush. Give myself a little more control and just a different... you know, using a decent amount of water to keep it flowing. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and just give this a second to go as well. And I think what I'm going to actually do is kind of jump down here to my darker green, and I'm going to very softly just start to paint up. And I'm not as worried because I've got two colors now that are, you know, if they start to blend together, it's okay. When we're doing the washes, especially if the color, like where the green and the green are together, I kind of like that because it's helping me to fade those in. But if we were to try to do a real detailed section and there was any sort of moisture on the page still, we won't get it. It will bleed. So the beauty of the wet material is good when you want it to blend, and it's not so good when you're going for details. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and just kind of let this dry for now. It's going to take just a quick second here. And in the meantime, I would like to go back in here and actually start working with my drawing. So I actually have this cool silver marker, and I think I'm going to actually use that here on this pole because I think of this as like the metal bar. So I may do that, and then we could also use some colored pencils too if we need to, just to kind of jazz up our drawing. And the colored pencil is fine to use with your watercolor. So if you're going to go back in watercolor, it's really quite, in fact, you know, colored pencil has enough wax in it where it actually kind of resists. You can usually get away with even painting over it if you need to, and just kind of wiping it clean with some fresh water if you get it, you know, too heavy. There's a little metallic there. I think I'll do some metallic here as well. Just adding in some colors. Thinking about that wood grain. I've got a peach here. I've got kind of a yellowy color. And a couple of different browns. All right, so you can get the point of that. What I want to do now is to do a little Zentangle. Everybody has a different interpretation of what Zen Doodle is or Zentangle. It is used a lot of times in kind of it can be a little bit weird in the sense of yoga of the mind. And some, you know, there's been issues before with certain people's viewpoints of yoga, and I certainly, you know, don't get into the spiritual side of that, but I do find that there is a lot of truth in calming our bodies down, exercising our bodies, and also the same with our mind. And for someone who is creative, Zen doodling or Zentangling is a really cool way, especially to pray. And so we often use lines and colors and shapes and small drawings to focus ourselves on that aspect of what we like to refer to as visual prayer. And so the same is true often when I'm thinking about something in Scripture. If I want to take the time to kind of digest it and just think in my own thoughts, I doodle. And so the beautiful thing, though, about Zentangle doodles is it's this repetitive nature of designs, and you just kind of let it go. You don't really have a plan. You just kind of go for it, and you see, you know, how one design leads into the next design. And so I've always really enjoyed kind of just using those ideas, especially in my classroom, because we often talk about the element of art, line, and what you can do with line and how you can really, you know, make it beautiful just on its own. And so I may start with something like this. I may add some different elements of value. So there may be some places where they're colored in, maybe some places that I add in extra lines to kind of create texture. And I just start to play with those spaces. And I think it's really relaxing. I think it's a great way to just slow down and just enjoy the creating process and be able to reflect on whatever, you know, God places on your heart. I feel like in this verse for me, just the whole principle of knowing Paul's entire story and knowing, you know, he was obviously very thankful to this church for supporting him and getting him through. And he says, you know, it's funny because he says in here, hold on a second. Not that I am speaking of being in need, because he was. The reality was he was in need. But he's saying it almost like, not that I'm in need or anything, but I've learned how to be content. And that's the point, is that even when he was in need, it was okay with him because he had found that way of using God as his strength through that time and finding contentment even within that need. But I just think about that in my own life. Like, where in my own life do I need to really find that contentment? And where do I need to let God just take over the wheelhouse a little bit and help me to find that peace. Okay, so I would continue drawing and filling and go throughout this entire arrow. And why? Well, just because it was fun. There's no real purpose to it except that it just allows me a hollow space. You could, of course, color it. You could write within it. There's all different things that you can do with hollow spaces. This was just a great way for me to kind of slow myself down and to think about this passage of Scripture and how that really, what God was calling from my heart out of this passage. What did He want me to think about when I'm on this teeter-totter of life? Okay, let's go back here. I think I'm going to go right to my really tiny brush. This is my little detail brush. I highly recommend, if you enjoy painting, get yourself a fine liner. That's what they're called, fine liners. They're not very expensive usually. Doesn't really matter what brand you get as long as you get a good, a decent quality hair. So here's where I would come in and I would probably start to build in some of my details. And you know what? Going straight to the grass, I need to get these kind of bushy trees done first. So let's do that first. I'm going to actually mix a green here with a little bit of a lime, and I'm going to come in here and just kind of distinguish a little bit of a more rich tone first, and I'll show you why this is important. I want to bleed this down. So that was why I don't want to do that grass first. I kind of lied there. Okay, so I'm going to take the rich color that I have at this spot where I want to kind of distinguish the far distance from this in between, this kind of bushy section of trees, and I've got a lot more pigment this time. But while this is still wet, I'll get a little bit of water and I'm going to bleed this down. Bleed that right down into the color that's already existing, and that will make it have a nice flow down. And then I can go through there and add those little bits of blades of grass that just gives us that extra little bit of texture. Okay, so I'm just kind of laying it on the side, wiggly, wiggly, wiggly. Love to wiggle that brush. And that will really define that one layer. You can see how that starts to pop out from the layer behind it. That layer behind it becomes more in the distance. And that's really what things should be. It should be the things in the distance should have less detail, less definition, and then as we move forward, we become more and more specific with our details. And usually richer in color as well. Then I just get a little bit of clean water on my brush and kind of come back in there, just like that. Okay? And you can see how you can do as much or as little as you want of this. Again, we're doing soft, subtle backgrounds, nothing major. And then once this dries, I can start to really define this grass. But you know what I think I'm going to do first? I think I'm actually going to define this edge where the sand is just a slight bit. Maybe a little bit darker tones in here. And that way when I pull that grass up, we can see and that gives us more of that defined edge to then be able to go back in here with some grass. We'll see if this is... Now, if you're green, if you don't have as many tones, and I definitely have not been doing as much mixing as I would normally say, but I have enough color here for the basic that we're doing. But what we use is this part of your palette. That's why my palettes are always so dirty. I mix a lot. So this is why you have compartments on your palette and this nice topper, is to actually pull these paints over, right? And then you can mix. So if I wanted to make a darker, richer tone of some kind, maybe a dark, more of like an olivey color, I can bring that over and really just change things up a bit. So that's what this palette is for. And the beautiful part about that is if you're painting and you have to stop early, you'll still have the dry color to, warm it back up and get back to it. The trickiest part, though, when you're mixing is to make sure that you keep enough pigment there. Because if you mix with a bunch of water, often then when you go back to use that, it is not, there's not enough color. All right, so I should be okay here. And I'm just going to go a little crazy for a second. Grass in different directions. Pull that grass up in different directions. There's all different ways to do this. This is pretty old school. This is very childish, bringing the grass in like this. And of course, I could bring some little spots of grass in here as well. May have to change my tones a little bit. Woohoo! Does that scare anybody? It scares me. Anytime you have a blob like that, I put too much color down, you want to just pat down straight down with a dry paper towel and leave it be. I won't even go near that spot until I have this dried. Okay, so you can kind of just go through here, adding those details in wherever you might like. You can always make it darker by adding dark brown or even red. I know that's crazy, but your red and your green are across from each other, so it's going to tone it down. A little bit of a darker brown will add value to make it darker. And so you can just have some fun in that regard. Now, the other thing is that if you wanted to, in some places back here, in this far back tree area, you may even want to come in and pull in some little, some branches. Maybe add in some implied branches every now and then. And if you do that, if you imply those little branches, you can go back in here and kind of define that part of the tree alone. Okay. So just play around with the shape that's already there. It's almost like when you do something like that, it's almost like you're looking at the clouds and trying to decide what the shapes are. So just look at how your marks were behind there and then just start to pull up some details. So that's kind of the overview of what this page is going to look like. I'm leaving letters and words off of this particular page, but I'd love to see how you use some of these concepts in pages of your own. So however you interpret the painting or the idea of the teeter-totter or the arrows, the Zen doodles, whatever it is that you take away from this, I hope you've learned something here that you can use on your own response to this beautiful passage in Philippians 4. Thank you guys so much for joining me as always. I've loved having you guys here.